Good morning. I'm Ken Weinstein. I'm president of Hudson Institute. I want to thank everyone, especially our panelists and our friends at the Institute for the Analysis of Global Security for coming out this morning on this incredibly damp, somewhat depressing morning to make it here to our conference on the rise of radical Islamism in the South Caucasus, Threat and Response, which we are proud to co-sponsor with our friends at the Institute for the Analysis of Global Security. And I'd like to give a special welcome to IAGS's founder and co-director Gal Luft, from whom you'll be hearing shortly. As all of us in this room know, the U.S. influence in the South Caucasus has been on the rise since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the South Caucasus, what we mean in particular Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia, with U.S. policymakers focused on security, energy, economic development, and of course democratization. Now, after 9/11, the South Caucasus acquired even greater strategic significance for the United States as it became indispensable for the prosecution of the global war on terror. In recent years, the region's importance has risen even further in U.S. eyes and in the eyes of U.S. allies. First, given its long border with Iran, Azerbaijan has become critical to continuously planning for efforts to try and thwart the Iranian nuclear program. As we all know, Iran in turn is seeking to foment instability and Shiite radicalism in Azerbaijan in return. And of course, more recently and more tragically, we in the United States saw the direct impact of Caucasus Salafist radicalism on American soil with the bombing at the Boston Marathon this year. Now, given all these issues and many others, the question for us today is what can South Caucasus governments and the international community do to prevent the rise and the further spread of radicalism? What can we do to help promote tolerant traditions of Islam among Shiite and Sunni Muslims? What is the U.S. security strategy and vision for the South Caucasus region? What is Iran's strategy for the region? What can the U.S. do to thwart that strategy? And perhaps most importantly, as we look at the U.S. drawdown from Afghanistan, what is the region going to look like in the aftermath of what is increasingly looking like a very significant U.S. withdrawal? Now, to explore these questions and many others, we have an excellent program, a very distinguished group of analysts today. We'll be having opening remarks from Joshua Walker, the former State Department aide, and we'll have two panels of very distinguished experts, one moderated by my colleague Richard Weitz, who's a senior fellow and director of the Center for Political and Military Analysis here at Hudson, and the second panel will be moderated by my friend Ariel Cohen, the senior research fellow for Russian and Eurasia Studies and International Energy Policy at the Heritage Foundation. But first, we have the pleasure of hearing from Gal Luft, who himself is in addition to being the co-director of the Institute for the Analysis of Global Security, is a noted analyst of the geopolitics of energy and our co-host today. So ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Gal Luft.
Good morning. I will just take 3 minutes of your time to welcome you, to thank Hudson for organizing this event, and to thank Ariel Cohen, who is a long-term advisor and friend of our institute, and in my view, one of the foremost experts on global energy security. And our institute, the Institute for the Analysis of Global Security, or IAGS, is a small, highly dedicated think tank that focuses only on energy security. That's all we know how to do. And of course, if you're in the business of energy, what happens in the world of Islam is extremely important because so much of the world hydrocarbons are concentrated in the Islamic world, and all the developments in this world affects how much we pay at the pump, which alliances will be forged by a country through the constructions of pipelines and other energy infrastructure projects. And of course, we are keen observers of what seems to be a raging war that is currently taking place within Islam, a war that has been going on for the past 14 centuries between Sunnis and Shiites. This recent inflammation of the feud is dropping casualties all over the Muslim world, and it will have an implication. It does already have implications as Sunni radicalism and Shiite radicalism are vying for new footprints, for new areas of influence. And of course, the area of our discussion is one of those up for grabs areas of the world. I want to add that this Sunni-Shiite divide tends to be is linked very, very closely to energy, in the sense that though the Shiites are relatively small minority in the greater Muslim world, however, in the part of the Muslim world that matters most to the world economy, that is the Persian Gulf, they are actually the majority. And by sheer fate, it turns out that when you look at the concentration of oil and gas, particularly when you look at oil, you see that 45% of the world's oil reserves, the conventional oil reserves, are located in areas that are inhabited by Shiites, whether it is Iran, Iraq, Azerbaijan, and also the Shiite province of Saudi Arabia, where most Saudi oil exists. So when the Sunnis and Shiites don't dig each other, that has impact on the world economy, on global markets, and that's why it's so important to keep a close eye on for people like us on what's happening in those areas. We are also very interested in the security of critical energy infrastructure. Only a year ago, the South Caucasus gas pipeline was attacked, and when you have a rise in radical ideologies and terrorism, one of the things that you see is a rise in the frequency of attacks against critical energy infrastructure, primarily pipelines, which are easiest to attack, and the South Caucasus is a very important conduit for energy for both oil and gas, and therefore the residuals of any instability always affects the security of our infrastructure and availability of oil and gas to the global market. For all of these reasons, we are happy to collaborate on this event. I don't know that we could be able to solve all of the challenges, because they are huge. And as I said, when we talk about long-term conflicts of many, many centuries, the reactionary approach to progress as manifested by increased radicalism and all of these areas require long-term thinking and a lot of patience. So I hope we can start poking into some of those issues today, and I welcome you. Thank you for your attention and for your participation, and I wish you all a very successful conference. Thank you.
Hi, as Ken mentioned, my name is Richard Weitz, and I'm the Director of the Center for Political Military Analysis here, and I want to reaffirm Ken's welcome to having you. I'm very surprised. If I were not running the conference, I would have just stayed home and watched it on the web, so I'm very impressed that you guys all came, and I think we'll have a great opportunity then for discussions on the side. We may shorten, to catch up a bit on time, we may shorten perhaps some of the lunch, but I'm not sure on that yet. We'll have to see. At the moment, we have one panelist who's dropped out, so that might be enough to catch up. But why I'm here right now is to have the honor and pleasure of introducing Dr. Joshua Walker, who is our morning keynote speaker. And he's the biography of Dr. Walker and all the panelists, the speakers, are available on your chair. I just want to highlight a couple key points which will help put his insights into context, that he is Director of Global Programs at APCO Worldwide, which gives him a great opportunity to connect the kind of issues we're discussing with the larger global trends that we're all concerned with. And he just left the State Department about 6 weeks ago. Very good timing, considering the mess we're all in now in terms of federal service. He was serving as Secretary Kerry's office as the chief economist. In earlier times, he had worked with Secretary Clinton on the Global Partner Initiative, and he's been contributing, though, to U.S. policy throughout the past 2 decades in various capacities. And so I'm really eager to hear his insights, and please join me in welcoming him to Hudson.
This is what you gotta love about DC. I'm really amazed, despite the weather, that everyone was able to swim their way here and talk about an issue that in many ways is slightly depressing. I think anytime you talk about radicalization, anytime you talk about the negative images of a particular region of the world, all of us that have spent time and have friends in this region of the world are particularly heartbroken in many ways to think that the Boston Marathon bombing would define an entire region and a proud people. So what I want to try to do is be a ray of hope in some ways. Many people accuse me of being an eternal optimist. I'm guilty as charged. Perhaps it's because I look as young as I do. The number of times in the State Department I'd have an introduction just like we had, and somebody would say, "It's not possible that you're Dr. Walker. You're the intern. Let me meet the real Dr. Walker." I assure you that is me. And I just have been either cursed or blessed with a baby face. My brother, who's 4 years younger, looks about 10 years older than me. Don't tell him that, of course. But the issue we're talking about, let me just start out. I'm not going to be the speaker who's going to stand up here and go through the history and the different movements and everything else that have come to define the South Caucasus. I think we could have entire conferences just on the terminology within the title and the terminology within the panels, and I suspect that many of our panelists will dissect and go through it. My job in some ways is to set the stage. And when I think about the topic that we have at hand, the rise of radical Islamism and the threats and responses, the role of government, the thing in my mind that sticks out are the things that are not included in there. And what can we think about to make sure that we do include them in there? I think particularly in this part of the world, if you look at the history of this region, and particularly kind of the nascent nations that we're talking about today, the republics that have only been in their 20s this year or so, coming out of the Soviet Union, you can't simply start today. I think one of the disservices we do, particularly in this town, and particularly as Americans, sometimes we focus so often on the present and the future that we never take a chance to look back. Now, some would say people in this region of the world do nothing but look back and don't look towards the future. So hopefully we can find a balance between what we do today in terms of being appreciative of that past, just like when you're driving a car, to look at the rear view mirror, to understand what's come from the past, why you're on the road you are, why there might be some obstacles and challenges that you have, but to keep your eye firmly in the present as you're looking to your left and your right lane, and then being able to look towards the future. And so hopefully that will be the framework that I'll be able to lay out. You know, the first point and the obvious point here is that geography matters. And this is something that as Americans we understand very well. We've been very blessed in many ways of being stuck between the Atlantic and the Pacific. And throughout history, you could make the case that the Eurasian heartland, which has always been the heart of human civilization, this is the first time in our history that the kind of great powers and the kind of the way in which the international system has been structured from on the outside in on Eurasia matters particularly. But it gets even more complicated than that, because when you talk about the South Caucasus, I like to think about it like a triangle. And whether you're talking about the present in terms of the great powers that we think of in terms of Russia, Iran, Turkey, and then I'm not even going to talk about the European Union and US for the moment, but you think about those players, they've been there for a very long time. This year, the Turkish Republic will celebrate 90 years, depending on how you count. You have the Islamic Republic of Iran, you have Russia. They all have been different incarnations, but I think anybody who's a student of history would say these people groups have been here for a very long period of time, from imperial history onward. And the people of the South Caucasus know this very well, because they've been in some ways on the victim end or the brunt on all these different periods of time. And so I think it's important as policymakers that we think about this and we think, what does that mean if you're stuck in a triangle and you're stuck in a very particular area? And so it's great that right now, in this moment in time, you look at the growth rates of a country like Azerbaijan and look at the ability it's been able to have in the last couple years and the decades because of its energy resources from the Caspian to really create a new narrative for itself, but then to think about the place in which they operate. And when you take a wider lens from that small triangle out to the challenges that it has to have of an Iran that's trying to get nuclear weapons, that's in direct conflict with the West, that has sanctions placed on it by the United States, a Russia that is reassertive, that is becoming more aggressive, that has demonstrated through its actions in Georgia that its near abroad is not something it takes very lightly, and you think about Turkey that has gone through some significant changes, both positive and negative, I would argue, in some ways. And obviously my own background has focused mostly on Turkey. And when I think a lot about the South Caucasus, I think about it through the prism of the connection between East and West. And so when I think about kind of the Turkic people of the world that have been on a Western journey from Genghis Khan through Tamerlane into Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, all their way to the gates of Vienna, and now today are in this geographically defined space of the Republic of Turkey, I think much broader. Because I think one of the great things of this century will be, how does a Eurasian heartland play itself out? How in a world in which we're becoming more and more interconnected, in which borders matter less and less, and the connections that we have, whether it's through Twitter or Facebook, people watching this right now, or whether it's about airplanes and logistics that are going through and stopping on their way in the South Caucasus, on their way to Afghanistan, how do those interconnections allow, on the one hand, for people to have a specific identity, to be proud of their cultural history and their unique identity, but then to be connected to something larger than themselves? And this is where the role, I think, in many ways, of religion, ethnicity, nationalism, these large trends begin to come in. And unfortunately, sometimes, having been a former, and I would call myself a recovering academic, we sometimes in the academic world like to really get specific and really drill down on specific areas, but then we don't ever look at the big picture. And on the other side, policymakers sometimes look at these very large pictures with never getting a chance to get into the specifics. And so in many ways you can tell I try to be a radical centrist in everything I do, of trying to appreciate and understand the importance of our academic disciplines, whether it's about political theory or whether it's about the history of a region, but at the same time understanding the immediacy of the now and how policymakers have to deal with crisis of the moment before they can move on to proactive strategies towards the future. And I think in particular, this region of the world has been a victim of this. Because many times people in the region will say, well, why doesn't America have a more coherent strategy? And I could certainly lay out to you what the State Department view might be on that. I'm no longer at the State Department, so I don't have to represent that anymore. But I think there are some very smart individuals that I've had the pleasure of working with who care deeply about these issues. And when you go and you meet with our ambassadors in the region and our assistant secretaries and our deputy assistant secretaries and the people who work on the desks of these regions of the world, there are no finer public servants, particularly in a moment in time when you see a government shutdown that's taking away their income as we speak. So I think the challenge is, it's not that we don't have capable people. Sometimes the politics of the now, and particularly in this town, where, to be very frank, the United States has 193 strategic allies. Now, some allies are created more strategic than others, I would argue. And the case is, how do we, as friends of people in the region, as Americans first, and then also as policymakers and analysts, think through how can we connect this region of the world to the larger whole? How can we think about the beating heart of Eurasia, which I would argue comes in many ways from the Caucasus? It may not be the biggest heart, it may not be the only lifeblood, it may not be the only DNA, but it is intrinsically woven into that. And so whether you talk about a Turkic world that's never been fully defined, that some would say goes from the Adriatic to the Great Wall, or whether you want to talk about this in terms of the ethnic divides or the religious divides that we see, it's very hard to talk about Islam or a Muslim majority nation without being specific. What are we talking about? Which interpretation of this? Because we've already heard in our opening in some ways, there is this major divide within the Muslim world between Sunni and Shia, and I would argue even within Sunni movements and even within the Shia movements. And I think sometimes as outsiders, we come in and say, well, it's all about Islam. Clearly, if this person had not had this interpretation, and that's just as silly in some ways, talking about some of the Christian movements throughout time that I would not necessarily point to as Christian movements or Jewish movements. It's not about that. It's about an ideology. It's about a polarization, about a radicalization where people begin to intrinsically believe that compromise is not possible because of the way they look at things. And to me, the way you combat that is not by trying to change someone's view on this. It's not about saying you're wrong, I'm right, I'm going to tell you why I'm right. It's about creating spaces. And I think those spaces that need to be created, particularly in this region of the world, are the overlap of where the public and the private meet. Now, I know when I talk about the private sector, many people in this region of the world, and particularly people who work in this region, they kind of politely smile at me and say, oh yeah, there's a lot of private sector, wink, wink, nod, nod, because most of the private sector, in some ways, the dividing line that we think about in the United States, that capitalism has so quickly created for us between our public leaders and our private, it's not as distinct. But I would argue in the United States it's not very distinct either. When you look at the rules that are changing politics in this country, the way in which money can influence the election cycle, everything else. So the term democracy, in my own understanding, has evolved in my own lifetime. To think about what it means to have a genuine democracy, a pluralistic democracy, in which it's not just about elections, right? It's not just about going to the polls. It's about having a civil society and having all these pieces that currently, because of the newness of the nations that we're talking about, they're simply trying to figure out how do we keep our sovereign borders, and how do some of the major conflicts that we have inherited, not because of our own doing, but because of the fact that we've been on the front line in some ways of these major conflicts between empires, between civilizations, and now nation states. How do we, if we're on the border, the frontier lands, how do we reverse this process? Because it's very easy, if you look at the history of the region between the Ottomans or the Safavids or the Russian Empire, they would trade back and forth different provinces. And when you look at the kind of inspirations or the influences, you see an amalgamation of these different cultures and different empires within these different nations. And I think one of the challenges is, how do you create an umbrella in which the private sector that begins to focus more and more on the bottom line? Because nobody in the private sector, and one of the fun things I get to do now, is trying to see where are the connecting dots here. Where are there opportunities that, for example, the energy resources of the Caucasus can help facilitate educational opportunities? How can you help create and take some of the great thinking you have of entrepreneurship? Because sometimes we so often look at regions like this that are stuck in these seemingly intractable conflicts, and we say, look, there's no way to solve this. It's going to be a zero-sum game. Either the Armenians or the Azeris are going to win in Nagorno-Karabakh, and then depending on how the Russians and the Iranians and the US and the EU put their chips on the table, then that will determine it, without thinking about the agency of the people on the ground and the grassroots. Some of the amazing opportunities and things I've seen of the person that's able to take a very small, woven or hand-woven handcraft and be able to make that into a more successful business, and being able to use that at a very small micro level to empower the people of that village and that region to have their own identity, to say, look, we're part of this larger world, and while we may not be able to be promoted in the same way because we don't have the resources of some of the big oligarchs, we can compete because we can get our story out there on the internet. We can go directly to the people by doing this. And there's challenges when you have regimes that prevent that from happening, when you have blocks that are placed on the internet, when you have discussions that are blocked, and at the same time, dangerous discussions that are happening every day in some of the chat rooms that we're looking at. So in many ways, what I'm defining and describing to you is the paradox that I would argue this region has always been in flux of. You have a paradox between the need to have an open and legitimate and civil debate on sometimes, but the need, on the other hand, for civility, stability, and security. How do you balance those? And we in the United States and D.C. certainly don't have the answer for that in some ways. But I think there are certain best practices you can look at. And when I look at the region, I think one of the challenges is when you're so focused internally on your own internal divisions, you don't get to look at the larger picture and to understand that when you're kept in this very small box in the triangle that I've defined, it's very easy for outside powers to have influence. And I'm not suggesting here that Armenia, Georgia, or Azerbaijan on their own can combat or fight with the Russians. We've seen that very clearly in Georgia. But I think that the international community, and particularly the West, which has made promises to these different countries as sovereign states that have incorporated them on very significant bodies, whether it's the UN Security Council or whether it's any other international mechanism, we have to live up to our promises. And so when I listen to things like the Eastern Partnership from the EU, when I think about NATO expansion, when I think about the role of these institutions, it's not necessarily that by snapping our fingers and including any particular country, things will change overnight. But it means that they become part of the fabric. And when I've had a chance to travel out to this region of the world, when I go and talk to the different people from the Eastern Partnership, you don't find anybody who's more committed and interested in the concept of the West than these people. And sometimes it's depressing frustrating when you go to Brussels or when you're having these discussions in Berlin, the short-sightedness sometimes of European politicians and certainly American politicians who can't see beyond their own immediate constituencies. So you have to create incentives. And the way you create incentives is by interweaving. And I think one of the interesting things is when you look at multinational companies and you look at the role that they play in the West, it's significant. And the energy companies, which have been the leaders in some ways of engaging in this part of the world, are often accused of being extractive, of simply taking the resources of one region and benefiting someone else. We have to change that calculus somehow. And I think the way you change that calculus is by opening and having a discussion in such a way that there's a transparent discussion of what's happening. Where are the energy resources going? How can we have a discussion in which the resources of this region are able to benefit everyone, not just one particular ethnicity, one particular nation, but all. And I think you see that in some ways. When you look at the state oil energy company of Azerbaijan, like SOCAR, I was very interested up in New York when the big UN meetings were happening. They had this huge Caspian Forum, and it's a new idea, a new concept of saying, look, how do we weave together? We don't want to be stuck in just the Caucasus. If we're only known for being the Caucasus, we always will have challenges. And with the Boston Marathon bombing, with what's happening in Russia and the Sochi Olympics coming up, more and more world attention is going to focus on the Caucasus. But if the people of the region are able to say, look, we see much bigger than this. We're much broader. We're going to connect. The Southern Energy Corridor will connect in the same way that the deal of the century last century connected Baku and Tbilisi and Ceyhan. This is going to connect us all the way into the heart of Europe from the heart of Eurasia. This will allow us, with the energy pipeline, to become major investors in the future of the region. I was surprised when I was talking to SOCAR representatives. They're the #1 investor in Georgia. Had no idea. They're the #1 investor in Turkey. I knew that one, right? And you think about the job creation. It's very interesting. It's the same things that we hear here in the United States over and over again. It's the economy stupid, right? It's about being able to create those opportunities. The challenge, I think, in many ways is you can't get to that second level of discussion or having a discussion about economy or energy security if you don't first solve some of the major conflicts we have in the region. And that's where the governments come in. And I would argue, having said earlier that we have some very great individuals in the U.S. government who are focused on this, they're not enough. And I think one of the challenges is people don't seem to understand that if we ignore this region of the world in the short term, the long-term consequences are going to be far worse. And in many ways, if we are able to put $1 towards proactive development assistance and being able to help in this region of the world, it will pay off tenfold in the future, as opposed to having to go in and deal with some of the major problems that we've already had to deal with in other parts of the world. And thinking about failed states is not something I want to contemplate after what we've seen in Somalia and Afghanistan. And so in many ways, as an American citizen, as a taxpayer now, as someone who works in the private sector and having seen what the public looks like, I look towards the future. At the same time, when I think about the future of the Caucasus, it's very easy to talk about the future of the Caucasus independent of other areas. I think everybody in D.C. has their own favorite region of the world. And if you speak Turkish or you speak other languages of the region, it's obvious that this is one of the hot areas. People want to talk about it in connection. But I think that what the Arab Spring has taught us in many ways is that we have to understand that these are long-term changes over time. And the international environment that is still going through major flux, having gone through the end of the Cold War into this new moment in which the United States has an opportunity that if it doesn't seize now and try to invest in places like the Eastern Partnership and places like the South Caucasus, that investment where people are already eager and interested. Often people are like, well, people must be very anti-American out there. And I say, if you haven't visited this region of the world clearly, because when you go to these areas, it happens every time I land in Istanbul, every time I land in Baku and other regions, you'll have a taxi cab driver, which is always a fun way to have a social experiment, who will give you a lecture the entire way. They'll drive you to wherever they're going, and they'll say, where are you from? From America. Ugh, America, your president did X, Y, and Z, and he did this, he messed up the entire world. What are you thinking with this Rouhani thing? The Iranians are like chess players. They invented the game of chess. You're insane if you think they're going to give you anything. And they give you a full lecture. And then when you get out of the cab and they say, oh, by the way, what do? You say, well, I work at the State Department. I teach international relations. Instead of it, in the U.S., this happens often too, but usually the cab driver says, oh, well, you should take what I say seriously. This guy is like, well, I know better than you because I live here and I'm telling you how it is. And they're very free in giving you advice on things. At the same time, in the U.S., there's the exact opposite reaction, right? When you say Turkey, most of the time, people are Thanksgiving. And if you say Azerbaijan, you don't even bother the responses. It's just this blank look of, is that a real country or is that made up in a Marx movie type of thing? And I think one of the challenges is this disconnect between feeling like you have so much information about the West and seeing things on your TV and having false impressions, and then on the other side, only having negative stereotypes, we've got to find a way to bridge that gap in some ways. And if we don't get people to people having connections, if there are not citizen diplomacy to help bridge the gap, then we are left with what to our own devices, where we have only governmental representation, and governmental representations, particularly in systems like the U.S., only work if you have members here, both in Congress and the administration, that have an incentive and say, look, we should be investing in these areas. We should focus on it. If you're going to make the case for the South Caucasus, then you need to make it based on larger interests. When you talk about Turkey's transformation and its involvement in terms of the Middle East and how it's beginning to become a much larger player, when you think about Iran's involvement in Syria and other places, and when you're talking about Russia's re-engagement around the world, you can't ignore the South Caucasus. In many ways, the keys to those major kind of future accomplishments in the future will come from the Caucasus, I would argue. And I think in turn, that will then allow us to have solutions to some of the issues that are going on. Sometimes the issues that we have in the Caucasus, the frozen conflicts, are not just necessarily with just Russia. I think it's very easy in this town to paint an anti-Russian flag on everything, and it certainly deserves a lot of criticism with Putin's foreign policy immersion. But at the very least, you've got to give them credit for staying on top of it and being very shrewd in their policy. I don't think we can say the same sometimes for the U.S. Sometimes we're so naive in our approach that we get very frustrated and caught off guard by saying, wait, why are the Russians able to get this, or why are they able to do that? And people in the region say, look, at the end of the day, we have to cut a deal with Mr. Putin, because Mr. Putin has determined that he's going to put his money where his mouth is. He'll put his tanks where his mouth is. Is the United States of America willing to do that? And I think that we don't have a very good track record in this region of the world or any other region of the world right now. And I think that the challenge is, for all the great rhetoric and all the language that we've heard about the importance and the strategic relationship of the Caucasus that our ambassadors in the region and people in the State Department talk about, it hasn't genuinely trickled down to the American population. It hasn't become part of the policy elite debates. So as a result, you have the same set of actors in Washington saying, yes, it's important, we should be doing this, and yet the people that say it doesn't matter have never traveled to the region, they don't speak the language, they don't have the opportunity to have those. And even if you have disagreements among these analysts, having that discussion like we're having today is critical. And if we're not able to have those discussions among ourselves and have these discussions of people at this level of what we should be focusing on, then I think that that's the real tragedy, because I do think the future of many of U.S. foreign policy priorities in Eurasia will emanate and will be enhanced through the South Caucasus cooperation. So obviously I've already talked about the energy piece of it. Let me just kind of wrap up in the demographic piece of this. I've already talked about the interconnectedness of people. And in many ways, the antidote in my mind is by focusing on the next generation. In all my time that I spend teaching and going around, I'm always amazed at the young people I see, right? As much as I get frustrated by the same old men I talk to, and they all are old men in this region, I think in many ways, when I talk to the next generation, there's a real difference. There's a real different mood and a wind. And the question is, what happens between where they are now as idealistic young activists who are really pushing for change and may sometimes may sometimes make mistakes in their youthful exuberance sometimes, but how do you go from that to kind of the old jaded approach here, where it becomes all about basically saying, well, the world is just against us and we have no option but to continue to be the victims of our own region. We're going to have to keep on being defensive, and we're never going to try to be proactive, despite some of the wealth that you have, both in terms of intellectual capital and in terms of energy. And I think one of the things is, how do you equip these young people to tell their own story? How do they weave their own narrative into a larger bridge that allows them to connect to the rest of the world? When you have events like Eurovision, or you have other international fora, OSCE, other different events, these events from an American perspective, don't seem to be very significant. They're another event that we have to go to. We got to send somebody. All these summits that we have and the different terms we like to come up with, the G20, the G8, I can fill in the blank with different numbers that we have out there. But for these regions and for these countries, this is very significant. This is the evolution of a nation in some ways. And so I think in many ways, the West and the United States in particular needs to pay attention to this. And when you have countries that say, we want to host the Olympics, we want to host an international event, we want to host this or that, that's an opportunity to not only bring people together and to tell a new narrative and a new story that says, look, yes, there are problems in our region. We have people that have been radicalized because of the way they feel that they've been excluded from the political process. but we are now creating new opportunities every day, and we're going to tell this story. And it allows you to have a hook into other areas that Americans that may not normally be your allies, people that you wouldn't naturally think. And I'm not talking about people that in some ways are already against you or with you, but people that are kind of the silent majority in this country that know nothing about this region. It allows you to bring them in. So I would just make that case that next generation and focusing on leadership development, focusing on the kind of the next generation, both in this country, but also particularly in the South Caucasus, and having exchange programs, having more engagement with the West, both in the European Union through things like the Erasmus programs, and also in the United States, of having people come to some of the best institutions, and us to be able to go there to help develop the institutions overseas, is got to be a critical component of our discussion. So I think I've already gone far too long, but hopefully I've laid the stage out there for my much smarter panelists to pick it up from where we go from here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Josh. That was a terrific speech. If I could just have the panel one up here with me, and we'll go ahead, just go straight into that. Again, thank you so much for coming. The first panel is going to focus on the developments primarily within the region and focusing on the rise of Islam and in the South Caucasus. Alexander Peterson called in. He's ill, so we're going to go down to the three panelists, which is fine because the other panel had three as well. And so each of the panelists will speak for 10, 12 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions and discussion with the audience. The first speaker is Dr. Brenda Shaeffer, who has a very interesting background, which we're all going to profit from. She works very closely in the region, has extensive knowledge of Azerbaijan in particular, but also has been teaching and working in Israel, but is now here for a year and a half. So we're all going to benefit from these insights. She's been speaking at several programs in town, and so we're very lucky that she could fit us into her schedule, as well as teaching. So thanks so much. I'm looking forward to this.
Okay, good morning. The panels have been divided into domestic and international influences on the developments related to Islam in the South Caucasus. And I think that actually in my presentation I'd like to show actually how these events are interlinked. And I think even following up to Dr. Walker's presentation, we tend to think that we're in an era where many of the conflicts that emerge are connected to identity, and we define them as ethnic conflicts, religious conflicts. This is very different, for instance, if how we looked at international relations, basically up to about the early 80s, we tended to think about wars as something in between states, interstate wars. And with the breakup of the Soviet Union, with the conflicts that emerged in the Balkans, we started to focus on intrastate conflicts and to think of that the source of these conflicts is actually identity. It's whether it's religious identity or ethnic identity, that it's something very local. But actually, if you really dig even deeper, you see that there is this combination of ethnic and religious groups, but generally a state, and meaning that it's much more similar to what we studied in the 70s about conflicts between states, but there's just an attachment of local groups. So for instance, if we take the breakup of the Soviet Union, very easy to explain the in a superficial sense, to explain the conflicts that emerged in the region as ethnic conflicts, right? So you have Armenians pitted against Azerbaijanis, Abkhaz pitted against Georgians, South Ossetians pitted against Georgians, Chechens pitted against Russians, and so forth. But actually, ethnic conflict or religious conflict can't explain what happened in the former Soviet Union, because if, let's say, we had at least 200 major disjunctures between various ethnic groups, or religious groups, mostly Christians and Muslims living side by side, and only 6 major conflicts emerged in the former Soviet Union with all those disjunctures and all the forces that could have led to conflict, that ethnicity or religiosity doesn't explain the conflict, because you had those groups living side by side in really about 200 locations, major groups, and with only 6 conflicts emerging, so we have to look for something else. When we look a little deeper, we see actually most of the groups, with maybe the exception of the Chechens, most of the groups that ethnic conflicts violent conflicts that were lasting in the region emerged had state backers. So if it was Karabakh, the backing of Armenia, if it was South Ossetians and Abkhaz backing of Russia, meaning that these were about conflicts between states with the use, not of their own participation, but with the use of ethnic groups. And maybe the certain people involved, their mobilizing factor was ethnic identity, was religious identity. But certainly most of these conflicts would never have emerged to full-scale wars between different nations if there wasn't the state backing. And certainly, if we think of the numbers, prior to the Soviet breakup, 120 Abkhaz, 90 in Abkhazia, 90,000 Armenians in Karabakh. No way these could have turned into full-scale wars that have really afflicted the security of the region for over 20 years if there wasn't the addition of state backers. So again, I think that as much as we like to think of this as an era of identity, it's there, but it's something that's used together with states. And even if we look at terrorism is only effective when it has a state backer. It can do make some noise. It can do some grab some attention. You cannot have a really sustained terrorist movement without even having the funding or the training of some basis of a state. So I think we shouldn't forget states. I'd like to give a few examples of how states, and especially the United States, actually affects religiosity in the South Caucasus, and especially some of the conflicts there. And I would say that almost all the countries that want to have impact in the South Caucasus, foreign countries use religious groups, whether it's religious organizations, schools, or individuals, to promote their interests. So we see this in the case of Iran. We see this even in the case of Russia, which is willing to support certain ethnic and religious separatists when it's in their interest. In the case of Turkey, we're supporting schools and different movements in Azerbaijan and beyond into Central Asia. And even the United States, that part of its interaction in the region is through religious groups or promotion of religious groups. So I'd like to take a few examples in terms of the United States, and especially in the case of Azerbaijan, which is the focus of my research, and then talk concretely about what does this mean, with also sort of a changing U.S. role potentially in the region with its sort of emerging new relationship with Iran. So first, in terms of the foreign policy aspects of the United States, I think that the United States, there might be something very different for what most of us as U.S. citizens, how we think about the U.S. policy or U.S. culture on church and state, and how many of U.S. institutions act abroad. For instance, it's very clear any child growing up in America understands what the separation of church and state means, and understands that it's an important sort of pillar value in the United States. And the United States is probably, by most surveys, is the most religious society in the world by the amount of people that on a voluntary basis go to a religious institution. But most religious and secular or anyone in between accepts that separation of church and state as something that's good for both sides, good for religious people and good for secular people. But when the United States goes abroad, it actually, through many of its institutions, whether it's through U.S. embassy programs, whether it's through U.S. aid, it actually takes a stand on exactly what should be that balance of separation of church and state that, again, many other Western democracies might look at the U.S. model and say this is not an appropriate model, or it's for their country. For instance, if a French could look at the U.S. model of church and state and say, no, it's still too close. You can still use money for religious schools, or religious programs, welfare programs are still supported through tax money, religious symbols in prominent places, religious values affecting freedom of choice on a variety of issues, right? And on the other flip side, you could take other Western democracies like the UK and Greece that, let's say, have a place for a legal place for the national church, in some sort of role and some sort of funding. You could say, okay, these are still Western democracies, but with a different take on church and state. Or even something like taxes to religious institutions, as we see in Germany and Norway, where you can, when you can check out which church you want to give your money to, part of your tax money to, a sort of on official forms, sort of official part. We have even for instance in countries like Greece and Israel, where personal status issues like marriage and divorce still is a strong role to religious institutions and somewhat of a monopoly, and still within the family of Western democracies. But when the United States goes abroad, it doesn't always respect that each other countries have different models of church and state. So for instance, Azerbaijan has adopted a model that is closer to the French model, which is a complete separation of church and state, where there is no religious schools as part of the formal school system, where there's no allowing of religious symbols in the public school system. And this has led to a divide, for instance, of U.S. criticism on the hijab issue, for instance, where because it's a religious symbol, just like in France, you can't wear a kippah in school or you can't wear a cross. The same thing in Azerbaijan, you're not allowed to wear a hijab. This is the model that Azerbaijan has adopted. And we find the criticism coming from two countries, main countries, United States and Iran. So here's a basis for some of their agreement about how Azerbaijan should organize its model of church and state. Or another issue where we see, and again, if you look at a more philosophical sense, the U.S. logic of why they're promoting the right to hijab in the schools in Azerbaijan is that religious freedom. But you have two conflicting principles here. One is freedom of religion, which would say, well, why can't a girl go covered into school? And one is freedom from religion, which why should children be coerced into this covering? And I would say it's not the place for a Washington policymaker to decide that balance. That seems to me a place that each society, just like, if I turned open today the New York Times, and I found in my personal values, when you look at what's happening in Ohio on abortion laws, you see a state working out a balance that maybe I might feel uncomfortable with some of that balance, but certainly it wouldn't be the place for some policymaker from France or Germany to come and try to teach Ohio how they should balance these relations. So again, even in the more philosophical sense, you see these competing principles of freedom to religion, but freedom from coercion, and it's kind of boggling that actually Washington could decide where this balance should be. Or on the question of foreign finance to Islamic groups. If you had Islamic groups in the United States receiving funding from Iran, that would be called illegal on terror financing, right? But when Azerbaijan tries to ban funding from Russia and Iran to Islamic groups that are involved in terrorist activities and underground activity, the U.S. condemns this as not allowing political financing, to Islamic civil society. And again, if it would apply its own laws abroad, it probably would find that these are actually some behavior that they would not allow U.S. banks actually to accept these kind of donations, but are actually critical of it when some of their allies do it abroad. So taking these questions where we see that on the issue of religion and state, U.S. is an actor, U.S. has an opinion. Of course, we can make even a longer case about, maybe we'll hear from Alex about Iran's activities in these, and Turkey, but I'm saying even the United States plays a role in the development and the relations of church and state in Azerbaijan. Just a little bit going forward, we're probably going to be having a lot more conferences, I think, on the South Caucasus soon, because the region really will be going through a lot of change. One of the major changes will be the developing relationship between Iran and the United States. And this will have important regional implications. It will have implications for Iranian-Russian relations, for Russian behavior in general, Iranian-Turkish relations. And I think a variety of players in the region are very concerned about what this will mean for the region bordering the region of Iran. You could even just take that President Obama's speech in the UN in the same period when he spoke to President Rouhani. He mentioned, of all the critical foreign policy issues that President Obama mentioned, sectarian differences in Bahrain, meaning oppression of Shiites, let's say, in another word of interpreting oppression of Shiites in Bahrain. Within hours of President Obama's speech, there were very serious demonstrations in Bahrain, a U.S. ally against the ruling government there that is an ally of the United States, meaning taking their tone from President Obama. So people are listening to the United States, watching this dialogue. It's affecting internal politics. And a big question is, in the long term, if there will be some serious reconciliation between Iran and the United States, probably the biggest loser from their perspective would be the current ruling elite in Iran, because probably a real reconciliation between the United States, where you have tons of U.S. businessmen, people coming into Iran, and interaction will be very hard for the regime under those conditions to keep its grip on the society. And I think that actually in the long term would actually lead to a very different government in Iran. And that's probably why it's been resisted. I mean, this is not the first time that the olive branch has been extended to the Iranian leadership. President Clinton, a number of Nowruz greetings. We also appealed to the same, at the time, to Khamenei, the same man who is really in charge, not Rouhani, but actually the spiritual leader. And this was frequently rejected by the Iranian leadership because they know the real danger of a full reconciliation with the United States is actually to the ruling regime in Iran. But the short term could actually bring a lot of danger and a lot of bubbling in the Islamic sector, because while this flirt is going on between, that maybe it's an inappropriate word, but while this attempt at reconciliation and a building of a different relationship between Washington and Tehran is taking place, the U.S. will probably not be very critical of Iran, will probably go out of its way to be understanding a variety of its actions, and this will be a time that Iran could be extremely active and giving a payback to those allies of the United States that have with great risk, have actually conformed to sanctions, adopted the sanctions, cooperated with the United States vis-a-vis Iran. And it's one thing if you're a Korean company that has to reduce its oil imports from Iran, maybe you have to pay a little bit more and find a new supplier, and that's a little bit of a financial loss. It's another thing if you're the government of Bahrain or of Azerbaijan and you're bordering Iran and you've actually been on board with sanctions, and what it could mean, how Iran would do that payback. So I think as the U.S. moves forward, has to understand that it should move forward with its allies, because if you desert your allies, when you come back 10 years later, they're not going to be so easy to access, and to make sure that as this friendship goes forward with Tehran, there's no consequences for the allies that have been together with the United States on its Iran policy. So thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. That was very helpful in helping set the context, the kind of the issues and concerns for all of us here. Our next speaker is Alex Vatenka. He focuses on Iran and for Iranian foreign policy in particular. He is currently an adjunct scholar at the Middle East Institute. For over a decade, he was known to all of us as the editor of the Islamic Affairs analyst for Jane's, which was publishing some of the leading articles on this. And he is currently writing a book on a topic. I've never read anything on this, on Iranian-Pakistani relations. So I think we're all looking forward to that one. So thank you, Alex, for speaking.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone. The microphone works? I'm not sure if it does, but it's a pleasure to be with you here this morning. I'm going to do as Dr. Walker suggested. So I'm going to start off with a bit of history, just to put Iranian relations with the states of the Caucasus in perspective. Then I'm going to move on and then tell you a bit about that fight that's happening inside Iran right now, the political fight. And I can tell you, as you all know, it's pretty intense. We don't know the outcome of this political fight, but it's pretty intense. And depending on where it goes, it could have implications for Iranian foreign policy, not just vis-a-vis the United States, but also neighboring states. And then finally, I'll tell you a bit about my perspective in terms of the role and the impact of the Arab Spring on Iranian thinking. I certainly think I'm of the view that what has happened in the region is having an impact on Iranian thinking in terms of where they're going to go with their foreign policy. And I will try and compare that to the regional appeal of the Iranian message, this message that we've gotten to hear for the last 34 years, this message of spreading Iran's revolution, where is it going in terms of the appeal when the Iranian regime actually faces the neighboring states? All right, let me set this history here when it comes to Iran's relations with the states of the Caucasus. So you got obviously a lot of historical and emotional attachment. There's no denying that the Caucasus has been at times part of the Persian Empire for a long time. Proximity is there, and as we all know, we can't avoid geography. But I say when I travel in the Caucasus, I see a lot of love and affection for the concept, the culture of Iran, what they call Iran Zamin, not the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I think there's a major distinction to be had. So I think there's a lot of pro-Iranian sentiment, but towards the, what I say, Persian culture, food, cuisine, poetry, you name it, not the regime's political message. Which is ironic, because on paper, a country like Azerbaijan should have been one of the most fertile grounds for the spread of the Iranian revolution. Look, there are 4 majority Shia countries in the world. 4. That's not a lot. Iran, Iraq, Azerbaijan, and Bahrain. Here's Azerbaijan, Shia majority, has very close historical ties, and for the last 22 years, the Iranians really, in my view, all they've done is play the role of a spoiler. They haven't been able to really make inroads. And they haven't made inroads for a couple of reasons. One of the major reasons is the fact that the countries of the Caucasus, particularly Azerbaijan in the context of Iran, has chosen Turkey and looked to the West. Looked to the West and has done so constantly for the last 22 years. On the other hand, the Iranians have prioritized Russia and the Arab states. So again, you see a conflict here. The Azeris, the Caucasians, are not paying attention to the southern neighbor as much as the Iranians would want them to do. And the Iranians have chosen to focus on the states of the Persian Gulf. And I think in some ways, certainly if you look at the last decade, it has paid off for the Iranians. Certainly it did in Iraq. All right, let me take you to the this political fight that I was talking about within Iran. To put it mildly, Ahmadinejad turned out to be a disaster for Ayatollah Khamenei. That his 8 years in power was a major experiment, and it turned out to be a disaster. So Khamenei's big ploy back in June of 2005 was to turn Iran into a sort of a resistance, at the forefront of the so-called resistance, turning Iran into a North Korea if he had to, and obviously did not calculate the impact of the sanctions. I can tell you nobody in Iran thought the sanctions that are in place today that began in 2006 would end up being as harmful as they are today. This is, as you all know, the most severe set of sanctions that have been imposed on a nation state ever in the history of mankind. So they are basically on their knees. And I think the election of Rouhani, in many ways, is a reflection of that position that the Khamenei regime finds itself to be. So I expect engagement to be the message that will come out of Tehran, but certainly I don't expect, to be honest, I don't expect the Caucasus to be at the forefront of Iranian minds when they're talking about engagement. I suspect they will be focusing on the United States first and foremost, because that's where basically the decisions on sanctions are made. The Europeans second, and then third, maybe even second, a country like Saudi Arabia, which from Iran's position on the regional front is key. So the Caucasus is important to some extent, but it's lower down on the list. And on that context, let me tell you why I think that is the case. Basically, you've had an Islamic Republic of Iran since the states of the Caucasus became independent back in 1991, providing Russia all the leeway Russia really wanted in that part of the world. This is my view. I think this is pretty commonly shared in Tehran, which is to say this is Russia's backyard, we respect it, and Russia has taken advantage of that, I think to the extent where Iranian national interests have been hurt. I have not seen the Iranians challenge Russia on any of the major issues that impact the Caucasus or the Caspian. Just to give you one example, 22 years later, the division of the Caspian Sea hasn't gone anywhere. I mean, a lot of that is the fact that Iran has not been able to or willing to challenge Russia, and that respect is still there. Let me turn to the Arab Spring very quick. It's not a two-way street when you look at Iran's experience with Arab Spring. I can tell you that it hurt a lot when Hamas turned its back on Iran as quickly as as they did when Syria had its civil war. I can tell you it hurt a lot when Muslim brothers in Egypt didn't turn around and accept the Iranian hand that had been extended to them for as long as it did. And I think you have a combination here of the impact of the sanctions on the one hand, the disaster that the Ahmadinejad presidency was for Ayatollah Khamenei, plus the realization in the circles around Ayatollah Khamenei in Tehran, perhaps. This is speculation on my part, but I think certainly there are signs, there is speculation in the household of the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei that the Arab Spring did not turn out to be an Islamic awakening as they were going around and preaching for as long as they did. It was actually more like a popular upheaval, the way Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, by the way, coined it first when it happened. So you have this, and they obviously don't say this in so many words, but perhaps the realization that maybe after 34 years, and again, this is a big maybe, but maybe after 34 years of preaching this idea of spreading the revolution, Iran should do, as Henry Kissinger has been advising him to do for a long time, start acting like a nation state with a narrow set of interests that you can pursue, you can identify and pursue, and stop this nonsense of going around and supporting every single anti-status quo group that exists in the region, which is, in many ways what the Iranians have been doing for the last 34 years. Saying that, let me give you one important qualifier here. I don't see the Iranian message as a very impressive one. If you can't convince your own population, then what chance do you have to convince others elsewhere? And I can tell you people from Kabul to Baku to Bahrain do look at this Iranian system and are not by and large impressed. Again, make a distinction. A lot of people living in Iranian or on the borders of Iran respect the country of Iran, but not the message that comes from Ayatollah Khamenei's office. So what you have here, if you look at the last, again, go back to the last 3 decades, what you have here in terms of Iranian successes to reach out to so-called, or radical groups, not so-called, but radical groups, are moments like in the 80s when they were able to create Hezbollah. In the 1990s, when Hamas were looking for an external guardian and Iran was willing and came to Hamas's aid. In the 2000s, the Shias of Iraq, again, Iran did not create those opportunities where we're taking advantage of people messing up. It was because of the civil war in Lebanon. Iran did not create the civil war in Lebanon, but was able to ride on the back of that wave. The same, Hamas was not something that Iran created, but when they needed financial support, the Iranians were there. Iraq, you have the same situation with the Shias in that sectarian fight that took place. My point, trying to link this to the Caucasus, is this. I've been to a country like Azerbaijan. You've had one of the fastest growing economies in the world for the last 10 years. On a socioeconomic level, things are working out. When I sat down and talked to the religious figures in Azerbaijan, when I read the Iranian analysis of what's going on, I don't get the impression that the Iranians think they have a real shot at going into a country like Azerbaijan and spreading their message. I really don't think that's what they think they can do. They can always find marginal elements in a place like Azerbaijan, as I said, one of the Shia majority countries. Always. But the question is that enough to basically rock the boat? Yes, there are Azeris that go to Iran for religious Shia education to places like Qom and so forth. But are they going to be enough in terms of quantities to be able to come back and shake the system? I doubt it very much. And I doubt it for a couple of reasons. Because as I said, the system in Azerbaijan, what it is, secular. Put aside the Soviet legacy for a second and remember that, by and large, the country is not looking for political Islam in any way and shape, except those fringe elements. People, by and large, have issues with their government, we know that, but are very happy with the socioeconomic conditions, by and large, again, in comparison to what you have in the region. And they look to Iran, what do they see? They see a system that more or less is not appealing to its own population. Foreign policy of Iran has basically brought the country to the brink, and that's why we have somebody like Hassan Rouhani showing up in New York with a big smile on his face, because their policies have basically failed. So I don't see an attractive Iranian message aimed at Azerbaijan. And I focus on Azerbaijan for the simple reason that's where you have the Shia populations, the Muslim population of the South Caucasus. So let me go to the very end here and say just a word about what the U.S. could do, if I could suggest anything. Look, we don't know the outcome of what's going to happen in Iran. A lot of people in Washington skeptical about whether Rouhani's olive branch is genuine. And as we heard, there's been olive branches being extended in the past, so you have a right to be skeptical. But as somebody who's been following the Iranian political scene on a daily basis for about a decade and a half, I have definitely sensed that there is a growing voice within Iran, within the regime, I should say. It's a very important distinction, inside the ranks of the regime, that says, look, our old ways are not going to take us anywhere. They've been saying that prior to Arab Spring, prior to the sanctions, prior to Ahmadinejad coming to power. If you remember, you had Khatami taking over in 97 on the whole reformist ticket. But I think the last few years with some of these developments, particularly Arab Spring, the impact of the sanctions, and the way Khamenei basically gambled and he fired in his face when he supported Ahmadinejad, has brought about conditions where you might be able to expect some sort of a major rethink in terms of their policies. Now again, as I said earlier, I don't think the Caucasus is going to be top of their list. There are no, acute interest at stake. Iran doesn't make its money out of the Caucasus. Iranian oil, 85% of its income comes from the province of Khuzestan on the border with Iraq down south. It doesn't have a political fight in the Caucasus because, as I said earlier, it's more or less given up and said to Russia, you can run this show, we respect it, because they're beholden to the Russians. But let's just say for a second that the hardliners do win this fight that's taking place in Tehran, and they are fighting Rouhani, there's no doubt about it. If they win, I just want to quickly say something about what Brenda said. What the danger there is, who will then be implementing Iranian foreign policy? It won't be the likes of Rouhani. It will be the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, the external branch, the Quds Force, people like Qasem Soleimani, who are, as we know, in places like Syria. Those are the people who will be out there, in their vision, implementing Iranian policy and seeking to implement Iranian interests. But history shows us what they do is they go out there and find the fringe elements that I was talking about, will arm them, will fund them, and that's where we have the danger. That's the danger if this fight in Tehran ends up being won by the hardliners. And as I said, there are many hardliners still in Tehran, despite the fact that Rouhani is now the president. The United States, final point, can really do itself in this country a major favor by not just focusing on one political aspect of Azerbaijan, or for that matter Georgia and Armenia, but look at the totality of the picture. And one of the things that Azerbaijan has going for it, which in my view, looking at 150,000 people dead the last 2.5 years as a result of the Arab Spring, much of it sectarian killing. You look at a country like Azerbaijan where Shia, Sunni, Jews and Christians do coexist without any blood being shed. That's a model that you can take. And I can tell you, the 25 million some people who are ethnic Azeris who live in Iran, the last 22 years have not been preoccupied with what's going on up north. If I told you otherwise, I'll be lying. I mean, obviously they follow what's going on, their ties and so forth. But as Azerbaijan is growing, that Azeri model is becoming something to look at and perhaps soon to admire. And that's something that the regime in Tehran fears too. But with that, I think I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. Again, that was very helpful for putting the issue in perspective of broader Iranian foreign policy. Our final speaker will be Dr. Svante Cornell. He is director of the Central Asia Caucasus Institute over here at SAIS, and they're probably the premier institute in this area. So if you have opportunity, I encourage you to go to their events. And he's also the co-founder of the Institute for Security and Development Policy on Stockholm, which I had actually an opportunity to speak at a couple of years ago on the Iran sanction issue. And it was very interesting seeing the diverse perspectives. He is, in addition to the chief editor of the publications of both centers, he's a prolific writer in his own right and has written 4 books on the region and many, many articles. And so it's a great pleasure to have you here, Mr. Fuente.
Thank you very much, Richard. And I'm going to start perhaps by being a little provocative, but Richard already knows this. And I think it's interesting that we've had 3 speakers on a conference about the rise of radical Islam in the South Caucasus, but we haven't really heard anything about Islam in the South Caucasus, certainly not about the rise of radical Islam in the South Caucasus. And I don't mean this as criticism to my fellow speakers and panelists, but the problem is the question, is there at all a rise of radical Islam in the South Caucasus? Now, I would submit that there are 2 ways of answering them. One is that the short answer is yes, there is such an issue. But let me put it quite differently. Is it enough to bring 100 people to a half-day conference in Washington on a rainy day? No. That's emphatically my answer. And I actually thought of this while being stuck in traffic, if it was really, if there was really going to be a lot of people here. But I'm glad I came, because there are. But let me get into my argument. I mean, my short argument is that radical Islam relating to the South Caucasus is essentially an externally induced phenomenon, and I think that's what the previous speakers have been focusing on. And what does this mean in terms of the kind of threat that it poses? I would submit that it poses the real area where it's a serious threat that needs to be taken care of is in the realm of terrorism. We have seen this over the past year in terms of serious terrorist threats against both American, Israeli, and Jewish cultural and religious institutions, especially in Azerbaijan, but also in Georgia. And these are part of the greater collection of terrorist attacks that are related to the Quds Force and to Mr. Soleimani, who the previous speaker mentioned here. And you can read all about it, of course, in the some details about it in the last issue of The New Yorker, which has a feature about this gentleman. And I think that is an area that must be taken very seriously, not least because there were direct targets against the U.S. Embassy in Baku. There were direct threats against the U.S. Embassy in Baku, and only because of the very active security cooperation between the U.S. and Azerbaijani counter-terrorist authorities were all these plots foiled, and I think the same can be said in Georgia. So I think this is an important area which suggested a clear policy implication to continue and to redouble the efforts at serious security cooperation, dialogue and counterterrorism cooperation with all the countries in the South Caucasus. And this is, of course, as far as mainly the Iranian-related terrorist threat is concerned. That's not the only one. We know, of course, that there are other terrorist organizations and groupings and networks with links to the Gulf region and to the North Caucasus that are operating in the area. I would say that they are a perhaps lower, less acute threat at the moment, but they're also a little harder to deal with because they are not government sponsored. And I'll get back to this in a moment. But aside from this terrorist threat, which again I think needs to be taken very seriously, I am not sure that this should be the focus of our attention, or actually I would argue this should not be the focus of our attention. We are right now in a time very different from perhaps 5 or 10 years ago when there was a considerable interest and a considerable engagement by the West in the South Caucasus. Today, certainly in the region, the sense is that there is a Western disengagement. And actually, if anything, where there has been a re-engagement of the South Caucasus, that would be in terms of the European Union's Eastern Partnership Initiative, which apparently the regime of Vladimir Putin finds so threatening to Russia's interest of establishing a sphere of influence that they managed to convince the government of Armenia very recently to forego 3 years of negotiations for an association agreement with the EU for joining the Russian customs union, which anybody looking at the example of Ukraine, it became very easily be seen that this is not in the interest of a country, certainly not one that does not border Russia. And President Sarkisyan himself clearly stated that this was mainly related to national security concerns of Armenia. So I think we're in a situation, and the point I'm trying to make is we're at a situation where any form of counterbalance to Mr. Putin's efforts at building a Eurasian Union, that in Hillary Clinton's words would be, we know what it is, it's an attempt to recreate the Soviet Union in another form, which of course would have very negative consequences and implications for America's access to the South Caucasus and America's access to the Caspian and into Central Asia. I think those are the issues that we should focus on at this time. But today, in a very dramatic
kind of U-turn or 180 kind of the exact opposite situation of 10 years ago when the U.S. was serving as a major external presence in the South Caucasus that was counterbalancing this U.S. as well as Iranian presence. Today, the European Union is doing that. And the U.S. is frankly not really on the playing field. So I hope, Richard, next time you organize a conference, let us talk about those issues. But now, on the issues of the rise of Islam in the South Caucasus, a few words on that perhaps, since it's our topic. I would say that internally in the South Caucasus, there is no tradition of radicalism. That's an important point, I believe. If you look at Azerbaijan, obviously the only Muslim majority nation in this region, if you look at the evolution of or the emergence of an Azerbaijani nation, an Azerbaijani state, which is a late 19th century, early 20th century phenomenon, it is very remarkable that there was no role of the ulama, of the religious authorities whatsoever. This was an entirely secular phenomenon, the rise of the Azerbaijani. There was never a discussion about whether this would take any form of a religious form. Similarly, in the transition to independence in the late 1980s, again, this was an entirely secular phenomenon, and the role of Islamic ideology was very marginal. Importantly, you have had, of course, as everybody knows, a conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan that resulted in the occupation of over 15% of Azerbaijan's territory, and still to this day this conflict does not have a primarily religious aspect. Now, of course, we don't know if that's going to continue in the future. There is obviously always a risk of the politicization of religion among the Azerbaijani, or so to speak, insertion of religion into this conflict, either by actors in society or by a future government in Azerbaijan. We can't exclude that, but it's not something that has happened over the past 20 years. And furthermore, if you look at, and there is some figures about the religious attendance figures, religious belief figures, thanks to the work of the Caucasus Barometer of the Caucasus Research Resource Centers. And the figures are actually quite interesting because they show that the interest in religion, attendance to religious services among the three countries of the South Caucasus is the lowest in Azerbaijan, by far. The leader is Georgia, where the level of identification with religious authorities, church attendance and so on is the highest in the region. Armenia follows closely after. And Azerbaijan is, if the figures in Georgia and Armenia are in the 80%, Azerbaijan is in the 50%. I don't have the exact figures in my head, but you can look them up online. And I think that suggests that's an important factor in if you will, I would say that the threat, if there is a threat to the secular nature of the state anywhere in the South Caucasus, it's not in Azerbaijan. I would say that it's in Georgia today. That's where there's a threat against the secular nature of the state. Azerbaijan obviously is a very strongly secular state in terms of, Brenda mentioned, the restrictions on the headscarf, very much in line with the policies of what used to be the Turkish Republic, the principles that served the Turkish Republic for about 70 years or almost 80 years before the current government slowly began dismantling the secular system instigated by or built by Kemal Ataturk initially. Azerbaijan, if you will, is the Kemalist Republic today, you could say, in many ways. But I would say that and I think somebody mentioned, there are pockets of resistance to this secularism in Azerbaijani society, but on a whole, the secular nature of the state is not controversial in Azerbaijani society. Now, of course, I think what is very likely to happen over time is a scenario that is quite similar to the Turkish one, namely where you have in society a rise of religiosity that begins to threaten, that begins to challenge this secular form of the state in various ways. But that does not necessarily mean radicalism. And if anything, our title today obviously is radicalism. So a rise of religiosity, a debate, a deep societal debate over what secularism means, what should be the form of secularism, should there be a secular society. That, I think, over time, in 20, 30, 50 years, is likely to happen in Azerbaijan. But that does not necessarily mean radicalism. And if anything, I would argue that one of the lessons of the Turkish model is that a strong secular state that nevertheless maintains certain levels of freedom of debate in society is an effective antidote against radicalism. It's actually been a force to moderate political Islam in the country. And I think that I'm not by no means a friend of the policies of the AKP government in Turkey. Many of you would know that. But if you compare political Islam in Turkey to that in Egypt or anywhere else in the Middle East or places like Pakistan, you would certainly find that moderate Islam in society in Turkey is very actually devoid of radicalism. Radicalism is a marginal force in Turkish political Islam. And just as an aside to that, I think we very often have the kind of narrative about political Islam, radical Islam emerging as a result of repression. It's an answer to repression. Now, that may be, but I would say that to empirically prove that or convince me, you have to convince me how it is that the laissez-faire attitude of the Pakistani governments over decades have seen the rise of the most radical and violent movements in the world of political Islam, and why other countries in the Middle East that have had more repressive policies against political Islam have by no means seen any scenario similar to that in Pakistan. So I don't buy that narrative as repression being the major force that directly relates to the rise of political Islam. It's a much more complicated factor. I think issues of economic inequality in a country like Azerbaijan are probably much more of a factor, given that political Islam, which we tend to place on the right of the political spectrum, very much also plays on the left of the political spectrum by being arguments of religious justice and defeating inequalities. And in a place like Azerbaijan, where the income gap in society has expanded as rapidly as it has, I would say those are some of the issues that would need to be addressed. I already mentioned Georgia. I know Ambassador Yakubashvili will speak more about this afternoon, so I will allow him to keep that focus and keep that issue, so to speak. But I think, as I said, in Georgia, the problem is really that the political appetite of the Georgian Orthodox Church and its intolerant attitude towards minorities, especially Muslims, I would say carries in many ways a considerable threat, I would say, of, if this goes on over a period of time, of a radicalization among parts of the Muslim community. You may have heard of the forcible removal of a minaret in a church in in a mosque in southwestern Georgia not long ago. Efforts by church and church-related groups in society to prevent Muslims from actually not only building mosques but congregating even to pray. These type of issues, I think, are, if they continue over time, carry quite considerable risk of generating a backlash. But I'm sure Ambassador Yakubashvili will speak more of this. Now, as I said, this is an externally induced phenomenon, and just before concluding, I'll just say a few words about this. In terms of the external influences on religious movements in the region, I think you have really four different areas. Iran has been spoken about a lot. The North Caucasus is another one. The Gulf region is a third, and they are very often related. And the fourth is Turkey. Since Iran has already been addressed, I won't spend a lot of time on it, but only say that the Iranian, and I agree with the previous speakers, that Iranian proselytism, Iranian activism in the region has been ineffective. And I think it's so for a very strong, very clear reason. The fact that Iran at once is trying to promote religious ideologies in Azerbaijan, and on the other hand, has effectively been on the side of Armenia in the conflict, or is certainly perceived in Azerbaijan as having been on the side of Armenia in the conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, has, if you will, delegitimized the Iranian regime and any efforts that it would have to gain a mass following in society. Again, marginal groups, especially in the south of Azerbaijan and in some areas around Baku, have been amenable to this message, but I think on the whole this is, again, as far as society is concerned, a marginal phenomenon and will remain a marginal phenomenon. But I think I made the point earlier that in the case of Iran, we're talking about state-sponsored religious proselytism. Iran basically flips a switch, if you will. When they want to put pressure on Azerbaijan, they flip the switch, and then you have terrorist organizations, you have Iranian-trained mullahs basically advancing into the country, so to speak. And when for political reasons they want good relations with the government of Azerbaijan, they flip off the switch. which means that this is actually, there is something behind it which you can work with, if you will. And Azerbaijan is very well aware of this problem. And what we have seen over time is that the Iranians tend to flip the switch on whenever there is a strong American presence in the South Caucasus, and certainly at times where the Israeli-Azerbaijani relationship has been advancing. On the other hand, when the US, so to speak, has been seen as disengaging from the Caucasus, there has been less of an Iranian interest in pressuring the Azerbaijani government. Which brings us to what was discussed earlier with Rouhani, namely if there is, I think, a flirt, there could be a love fest between the US and Iran that might be short-lived. So the question, and I'm not sure, will the Iranians decide that this will give them an opportunity to punish US allies? It is possible. Another possibility that they will see this as reducing the presence of the United States in the region, reducing the threat, which might lead them to employ other tactics to achieve their goals. I'm not sure what will happen, but I'm saying that there are different possibilities. Now, relating to the North Caucasus and the Gulf, we're talking about the Salafi influence, of course, and the fact is that if you would like me to rank the external powers or external countries as the greatest threat relating to radical Islam in the South Caucasus, I would say it's Russia. And it is Russia because Russian behavior, Russian policies in the North Caucasus have turned what once was a nationalist Chechen rebellion into a low-intensity conflict motivated by radical Islamic ideology across the North Caucasus, which obviously for years now has been trickling down into both Georgia as well as into the northern areas of Azerbaijan. And because this is a non-state actor, and even the Gulf movements that are supporting the same groups in the North Caucasus are often very opaquely related to state institutions, they are very difficult to deal with. And finally, I mentioned Turkey as the fourth, and the issue with Turkey, Turkey of course also supports the expansion of religious influence in the region, but this comes in the form of an organization and a movement, especially the Fethullah Gülen movement, which is not radical in nature. So it's a little bit outside our panel. But what you see in a place like Azerbaijan is that because it is not radical, and because it is seen as a potential antidote towards Salafi ideologies and even Iranian ideologies, it is tolerated and even sometimes favored by the government. Whether that is a smart policy in the long run, that I think is a topic for discussion. Now, again, to conclude, for U.S. policy, I think the issue really is not about a threat of radical Islam in the region. I think the concern or the implications for U.S. policy are on a broader level. Namely, as previous speakers, I think Dr. Walker mentioned this and others too, these are countries that for a very long time have been oriented themselves towards the United States and who have taken risks, and especially being a border country with Iran, Azerbaijan has taken considerable risks. Georgia has also taken considerable risk and paid a price for it, as we all know, for its Western orientation. And if anything, at this time in history, there is a need for re-engagement rather than disengagement of this region, and for the U.S. to consider the interests of its longtime allies when it is dancing with Mr. Rouhani, as well as contemplating other policies in the region. Not least one issue that hasn't been mentioned so far, which is the Syria issue. Namely that the way in which the Syria issue was handled, the way in which the U.S. basically allowed Russia to re-enter the Middle East and to be the kingmaker, if you will, and to save Assad, made a very strong impression on people in this region. And again, in this, I mentioned the New Yorker article that is a feature of Mr. Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force. There's a very interesting passage there that is attributed to him where he says, "We're not like the Americans, we stand by our friends." And if that becomes the general sense in the region, then we have a problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Svante. That was excellent, helping to complement and supplement and sometimes balance the entire perspective. So we're supposed to have ended by now, but I want to give everybody who wants to a chance to ask their question. So just go ahead and ask them all, and then the panelists can reply as they wish. And I have two ladies with the mics. If they could, one, Victor, if you want to come up here, we've got a guy. Yeah, and if you could please identify yourself when asking a question, and of course, as people are aware, we are taping this and live streaming this. So if you can't give your affiliation, we understand.
Hello, my name is Hassan. I was born in Tehran. My question is to Alex. Would you envision in future that the two Azerbaijans will unite together like they were 150 years ago?
Okay. Remember also to hold the mic very close to you, so get caught up for the people live stream viewers. That was fine, but make sure everyone does that.
Okay.
Okay, so next, you want to pass it to the next person? Please raise your hand if you want to ask a question or make a short comment, but mostly I just want to get questions, make sure everybody has a chance. Of course, you'll be able to talk with these people on the side too as well during the lunch break. Any other questions? Is that it? All right, go ahead. We have one more. I mean, that's okay if you want to wait and maybe put them in panel 2 if you're more interested
My
in
name is
policy.
Alexis Sabchenko. I'm representing here myself. Question to Mr. Cornell. You mentioned that there are some pockets in Azerbaijan, specifically in southern Azerbaijan, where there would be a field for radical Islam to expand. Would you please specify in geographical terms? Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? If not, then why don't you guys just answer?
There's one right there.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, Andrea Weinstein, Embassy of Armenia. It's not a question, it's rather a comment to Svante Cornell's, Mr. Cornell's presentation. Obviously, Mr. Cornell didn't like the title of this today's session. That's why he went to very different aspects covering the whole range of political issues from the Eastern Partnership to Nagorno-Karabakh conflict to real perceived relations between Armenia and Iran. My comment will be regard to your statement that there is an occupation of Azerbaijani lands. I understand you have your point of view on this issue, but just for the record, I would like to mention that the internationally mandated mediation group of co-chairs of Minsk group didn't refer to this territory as an occupied territory. So that's for your consideration for the future. Thank you.
Okay, okay, we have a couple in the back there. Actually, we have several in the back.
Hi, just because the panel was on the rise of radical Islam, I was wondering if anyone could add any more insight into how either the government of Azerbaijan is relating to the radical Islamists in the area that are spilling over from different regions, both from Iran and from the North Caucasus.
Hi, my name is Yusuf Babanli, Azerbaijani State Telegraph Agency. I wanted, it may be an old topic, it was the WikiLeaks revealing the U.S.-Armenia relations in 2008, particularly the purchase by the Armenian government of the arms, particularly 1,000 RPGs and 260 machine guns from Bulgaria, and then reselling it to Iran, which eventually were found at the hands of Hezbollah brigades, which resulted in the death of one U.S. soldier and 10 wounded in Iraq. After repeated assurances from the Armenian government, specifically by President Sarkisyan, the emotions subsided. I wanted to ask the entire panel, what kind of instruments does the United States possess to control the flow of illegal flow of arms to Iran by the Armenian government or any other government in the region? Thank you.
Alexander Miligishvili, I have two questions, and thank you for your presentations.
Can you speak up and hold the notes here?
I have first question has to do with the actually I have it to Alex Vatanka. I was wondering if you can comment on Tehran's evolving position on Karabakh issue, because there's been sort of mixed messages about Iranian position on the Karabakh conflict. And the second, really quickly, I was wondering if you can comment, and that's to the entire panel. I was wondering if you can comment on the influence of the Syrian conflict on the situation in South Caucasus, and I'm asking you this because of the fact that I don't think I'll surprise you if I say that the Syrian conflict is turning into basically a magnet in which you have sort of news reports about both presence of the Azeri as well as other Kazakh and other foreign fighters who are participating and I wonder what you think about their potential return if the conflict subsides. Thanks so much.
Emin Ibrahimov from the Embassy of Azerbaijan. I have a question, but before that I'd like to recommend Armenian colleague to go back and study better the documents regarding the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict. There are number of countless international documents unquestionably answering this question that actually it's no longer a question that Azerbaijani territories, almost 20% of Azerbaijani territories has been occupied by Armenia, and this occupation is still ongoing. Even United Nations Security Council, which is the main primary body which is responsible for international security, has 4 resolutions which say that Armenian occupying forces must immediately withdraw occupying forces from the occupied territories of Azerbaijan. Well, my question, obviously I come from the Azerbaijan. We have a long tradition of diversity, respect to diversity. Personally, I always had and I still have Jewish friends, Russian friends, Armenian neighbors, and I still do. And of course, we always consider this as a
I need the question because we're holding everybody.
I'm coming to this question. It has to do with my question. We always consider this as respect to diversity as a historical achievement of Azerbaijan.
And remember to hold the mic up.
So my question is, how do you think Azerbaijan and United States should work building on this historical achievement? Or how do you think this segment should be part of this bilateral relationship? Thank you.
All right, we have 2 more questions. What I'm going to do is let you say them, but we're not going to have time to do the answers. I would think that you guys can talk with them individuals. But I want to make sure that the audience gets to raise the issues that are on their mind. So go ahead and just ask the 2 and then.
Aram Avetsyan, Office of Nagorno-Karabakh Republic. I would like to just mention that to my Azerbaijani colleague that the issues of Nagorno-Karabakh issues does not include only territories. It includes territorial integrity, self-determination, and non-use of forces. These all 3 equal principles. So you cannot only rely on one principle, and you cannot raise only one principle for the resolution of the conflict. But since back to the topic, I would like to say that we in Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, we feel the Islamic radicalism on our own, because during the Karabakh War, Azerbaijani youth recruited around 5,000 mujahideen who fought against Karabakh Armenians during the war. Plus, it's well known fact that another terrorist from North Caucasus, Shamil Basayev, was also participated in the Karabakh war against Armenians. I would like to raise probably a rhetoric question, but don't you think that in today's realities, when we feel every day threatening statements from the Azerbaijani government, don't you think that in such kind of environment that can be also raise radicalism, Islamic radicalism as well? Thank you.
Thank you. But no more Azerbaijan, Armenian, Karabakh questions, because I think we're aware of this issue, and it's causing problems for all sorts of reasons. We mentioned some of which were mentioned, but it's such an important and such a complex issue. I don't want to just throw it off in a couple minutes. So just please ask the questions about the other issues related to Islam. If you go to comments, if there are any more, I think there's one. Go ahead, please. Or two. Go ahead. I think the woman in the far back. Go ahead, please. And then.
May I just? I do really apologize about that, but it has been mentioned some entity that the person just called himself our colleague. We're not lobbyist organization that you do. We're the members of the diplomatic mission here, members of the Republic of Azerbaijan. There is no country in the world, including Armenia, never recognizes such thing called, as you called, Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh, and one thing that Azerbaijani authority never threatens anybody. We're just asking for the liberation of our territory and the return of all the refugees and IDPs that ethnically, more than a million people that ethnically have been cleansed from their territories. I do apologize for that, and I'm really...
okay, I'm about to get the hook, so I want to let the woman in the far back ask her question.
Hi, my name is Nikki Kazimov. I'm a journalist from Azerbaijan.
Okay, closer and louder. That's loud. Really
my
loud.
question is to Svante, and you've relied in your presentation on statistics that in Azerbaijan the figures are the lowest in the Caucasus in terms of religiosity, and you also outlined the difference between radicalism and the rise in attendance of services, etc. If you look at the statistics, by the time the Soviet Union was collapsing, the number of people who could be identified as religious in Azerbaijan was at about, I think, 2%. Then 10 years later, I think it was closer to 8 to 9%. And another 10 years later, at this point, it's between, I think, 18 and 19%, depending on, most of the polls sort of have the same figure. So it's close to 20%. So it's about 10% rise every 10 years. So you've said that at some point you expect that there will be enough people who will become religious enough, not necessarily radical, to change the discourse and maybe question whether or not Azerbaijan should remain secular. So I would want your projection on when that critical mass could be reached. In other words, how many percent should become religious in Azerbaijan for the discourse to change and for the country to change its course, if that's what you were trying to predict. Thank you.
Okay, we're out of time, so I'm going to recommend that if you want to send me the email responses to any of the questions, so on, I will then walk back by listening to who's asked the question and send it to them, because I have the email list. Or you can talk to the person on the side, or they would probably, some of these issues are going to come up though in the next panel. So thank you very much. Please join me in welcoming the panelists, and we'll quickly proceed to the second panel.
Can you tell me your idea Iran, Azerbaijan,
Would I like to see it?
That 50 years ago, that is the question.
Sure. You know, it's not really my call as the ones who live in Iran and Azerbaijan, but I don't.
Well, because I wanted to make sure you could say what was on your mind. I wanted to hear everybody's answer.
We're going to start in 3 minutes. 3 minutes.
I don't know probably, but let me ask, when you ask somebody who's no, not really. I'll take you over there. But I'm not sure who uses my phone. What is the order?